France in the early 1700s was the most powerful kingdom in Europe, but it was also financially broke. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had spent decades draining the treasury. Endless wars and the over-the-top lavishness of the palace at Versailles had cost unimaginable amounts of money. It was a court that glittered with gold, while the country's debts piled higher and higher. By the time Louis XIV died, France owed so much money that the interest alone was crippling the country. And then there appeared a man who promised to fix it all. His name was John Law, a Scotsman, a gambler, and a convicted killer who'd escaped from a London prison after a duel. John Law had an obsession. You see, he believed that real wealth could come from trade and credit. So, a nation could create prosperity simply by printing paper money. It was a radical idea, but France was so desperate. It would become the testing ground for this new concept. With the old king dead, France was now run by the Duke of Orleans, who governed on behalf of the boy king, Louis XV. And the Duke of Orleans was willing to try anything to get the country out of debt. So, in 1716, he let John Law open a bank that issued paper banknotes. Then John Law was also allowed to create the Mississippi Company, which was given a monopoly on trade with France's vast territory in North America, a colony named Louisiana. It was at this point that John Law went to the people of France and began to sell his dream. He told investors that Louisiana was a paradise. Mountains of gold, endless fertile land, riches just waiting to be scooped out of the ground. Incredible. Except, almost none of it was true. And yet, as is so often the case in finance, the truth didn't matter, because people wanted to believe the story. As a result, shares in the Mississippi Company began to climb. And then, they soared. 500 livres, 1,000, 5,000, nearly 10,000 livres per share. The streets around Law's headquarters in Paris were filled with frantic crowds. Dukes and servants stood shoulder to shoulder, screaming to buy. And it was at this time that a new word entered the language to describe the sudden fortunes that were being made: millionaire. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the whole project ran on paper. Law's bank printed banknotes to let people buy shares. More and more people wanted the shares, so more banknotes were printed. The rising shares made people trust the banknotes, and each banknote propped up the other. It was amazing, but none of it was backed by anything real, and that's exactly why it suddenly started to go wrong. And that's because a few large investors began cashing in their shares and demanding gold in return. And then a flood of investors wanted the same, just like a run on a bank. Everyone realized at the same moment that there wasn't enough gold to go around. And worse than that, there never had been. The share price collapsed. The banknotes became worthless. Those fortunes had existed only on paper, and now they simply vanished. Families were ruined overnight, and the streets that had roared with greed, now filled with rage. John Law, once the most powerful financier in Europe, fled France in disguise, and died years later in Venice, poor and still gambling. But the wreckage that came with Law's bank and the Mississippi Company didn't disappear when he did. The financial collapse left France with a deep, lasting terror of paper money and banks. Meanwhile, elsewhere, countries like Britain began building trusted financial institutions like the Bank of England and government bonds. But France was still scarred by John Law's project and couldn't develop anything similar. And that's when things got really bad. Because it meant when the French crown carried on overspending for decade after decade, it simply didn't have a healthy financial system to lean on, so the debt kept piling up. By the 1780s, the monarchy was effectively bankrupt, and many argue that is what led almost directly to the French Revolution, a revolution that would end with the king losing his head. So why does this story still matter? Because we still see the same thing happen time and time again. A new asset appears. A confident voice promises easy riches. Prices climb. Ordinary people pour in, terrified of missing out. And then, one day, someone asks to be paid in something real, and the whole thing unravels. Even so, perhaps the greatest irony of all this is that John Law wasn't entirely wrong. His vision of paper money, Central banks and credit-driven economies are central to the world we live in now. But John Law was just 300 years too early and far too greedy.